Trust is a very complex virtue. It's one of the most precious gifts you can offer someone, your trust. But what happens when that gift is broken? Worse yet, by the very person you feel the safest being around. Well, 17-year-old Bernadette Walker confided someone very close to her about a horrendous occurrence. But instead of supporting her, this person betrayed her. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because the very next day, on July 18, 2020, Bernadette just vanished. The case of Bernadette Walker is not only frightening, but it also makes you question who you can really trust, because Bernadette asked her close family for help. They offered none, and instead turned their backs on her. The victim and her. Parents, welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Perry. I post new true crime documentaries multiple times a week, so be sure to hit subscribe. It's totally free and keeps you up to date with my latest cases. There's no overblown drama, not too many crazy opinions, just true crime. Bernadette Walker was born on December 13, 2002, and today's case takes place in Peterborough, Cambridgeshire in England. Bernadette's mother, Sarah Louise. At some point after Bernadette was born, her mother decided to part ways with her biological father, but we don't really know anything about what happened between the two of them. Bernadette was known to her family and friends as Bea, and while she was a bit shy around new people, within her circle, Bea was defined as a fun-loving, bubbly, and all-around fun person to be with. Bea was fond of art, particularly photography. Bea's camera was with her wherever she went. This was why, after graduating high school, Bea enrolled in Peterborough College, where she was studying photography. Bea also had big dreams of moving out of her hometown of Peterborough and settling in the United States after school. Bea, like any other teenager, also loved social media, and because of her shy and introverted nature, she preferred to interact with her friends online. Bea also loved to knit, and this was something that she learned from her grandmother. The two shared a very close bond, and Bea was overall very close with her family. Every single person who knew Bea saw her as a gentle, kind, and expressive person who just wanted to chase her dreams. When Bea was just a toddler, her mom, Sarah, met a man named Scott Walker. Sarah and Scott were actually neighbors. She moved next door to him in 2006 with 5 kids and heavily pregnant with her 6th child. That's a lot of kids, so you can imagine the chaos that must have been Bea's home life. Her mother, Sarah, was also raising all of these kids alone. See, after things didn't work out between Sarah and Bea's biological father, she bounced around from one relationship to another and never really found anyone that she was willing to settle down with. This led to Sarah's 6 children, each having different fathers. The thing is, Scott, Sarah's new neighbor, was married at the time that Bea, Sarah, and the kids moved in next door. Scott and his wife Jill actually met in August 2004 when she was a single mother of 2 teenage boys, so they'd been together for about 2 years at this point. Initially, Jill thought that Scott was a very loving and thoughtful man, and their relationship moved fast. In less than 2 months, Scott moved in with Jill and her sons. But this was when Jill noticed a complete and alarming shift in Scott's personality. He became obsessive, controlling, and always wanted to know whether Jill was cheating on him with another man or not. According to Jill, this all came out of nowhere and was completely unexpected. Scott was very manipulative. Even though Jill claimed he never physically abused her during a heated argument, he made very frightening threats. And let's be honest, sometimes a voice can be a lot more damaging than a fist. All this made Jill feel very hopeless. Jill quickly became a victim of Scott's cruel abuse, but she couldn't fathom the thought of leaving him. In fact, they stayed together for 10 months, after which Scott asked Jill to marry him, which was as shocking to Jill as it was for you to hear. But sadly, because Jill was trapped and driven into a corner of abuse by Scott, she felt like she had no choice but to say yes. Now, I don't know if Jill thought that getting married might make things better, or if she truly was just being ruled by fear. But this was so heartbreaking to find out. The couple got married in 2005, and things only worsened from that point onwards. Scott was very demanding and selfish, and his behavior was completely inexcusable. It became clear to Jill very early on in their marriage Scott didn't have any respect for her whatsoever, only demands. This went on for some time until Scott set his sights on his new neighbor, Sarah Louise. Jill would constantly witness her husband flirting with Sarah. But Jill wasn't tormented or heartbroken over Scott's infidelity. Jill, as morbid as it sounds, wanted Sarah to have Scott so that she could free herself from the clutches of an abusive and emotionally manipulative man. Seeing him buttering up Sarah, it brought her immense joy. Jill saw this as a way out, and she, with the help of a friend, packed her bags and left Scott and even served him with a protective order that forbade him from being near her. Well, Scott didn't mind Jill's departure one bit, as he quickly dove headfirst into a whirlwind of a relationship with Sarah. Bea was still a toddler at this point, and she looked up to Scott and even called him Dad, which is so heartbreaking, knowing what happens later on. Even though Sarah and Scott weren't legally married, Sarah changed her and all of her children's last names to Walker. This makes it so clear just how serious Sarah was about this new relationship. Sarah and Scott also went on to have 4 more children of their own. If you're not great at math, that's 10 kids living under one roof in a house with only 5 bedrooms. It was safe to say that there were a lot of people and a lot of opinions in this home. Sarah worked in geriatrics, whereas Scott would jump from one odd job to another. Although one thing is for sure, Scott loved to brag on social media. He was always building himself up on social media, making himself out to be someone he's not. But things were far from perfect inside the Walker home. In fact, they were toxic to the max. One of Bea's brothers, Anthony, came out and claimed that Scott was physically and verbally abusive to everyone in the family. Anthony also went on to say that Scott was unfaithful to Sarah and that he had multiple affairs with a variety of women. Anthony also disclosed another disturbing detail about Scott. He had set up cameras in every room of the house, including the family bathroom. Let that sink in for a bit. There are 10 children in the house, and Scott has cameras in the bathrooms. In Scott's defense, the cameras were for catching Bea red-handed as she apparently hid candy wrappers in toilet paper rolls. But I can't help but feel like things are about to get a lot worse. What happened? It was July 2020, and things in the Walker household weren't getting any better. Scott was currently 50 years old. Sarah was 37, having just given birth to a baby girl in June, and by now Bea was 17 years old. Sarah, finally fed up with Scott's manipulation and behavior, was also ready for some change. Scott and Sarah had broken up, and Sarah was actually seeing another man named Chris O'Connell. But there was something very bizarre about this whole thing. Even though Scott and Sarah were no longer together, Scott still lived in the Walker home. In fact, Scott decided to turn things up a notch and set up rules for Sarah when was dating Chris. This man, I don't even have words. According to Scott, Sarah was only allowed to stay over at Chris's house 2 days out of the week. Also, Chris was never allowed to stay over at the Walker house. Now that rule, I get that one. It's Scott's house too, at least I think. But to tell someone who isn't your wife, isn't your partner, she's literally nothing but a roommate. At this point, when she can and can't see her boyfriend, that's just beyond the realm of understanding. Well, fast forward to July 17, 2020, at around 10 p.m., Scott drove Bea to his parents' house in Warrington. Bea was wearing all black clothes, with a blue denim jacket and black, thick-framed glasses. During the ride, Scott confiscated Bea's phone, but we don't know why he did this. And according to Scott's parents, Bea was visibly upset when she arrived at their home. Anyways, Bea went to sleep at around 1 a.m., and on the morning of July 18th. At around 10:25 a.m., Scott came to pick Bea up to take her home. But Bea never made it home. According to Scott, he had made a small stop to have a cigarette near Skater's Way when Bea flung the car door open and ran off. Scott tried to follow her, but he couldn't catch up, and in the end, he just went back home. When Sarah saw Scott returning home, she noticed that he was exhausted and was on the verge of breaking down in tears, but she didn't think much of it. Remember, she couldn't have cared less about him at this point. But what was alarming about all of this was that Sarah, B's own mother, didn't report her daughter missing until 3 days later, even though she noticed that she hadn't come home with Scott almost immediately. This is just not normal behavior coming from a mother. When a child goes missing, their parents, especially mothers, report it to the police right away. What took Sarah so long in reporting her own daughter missing? And what happened during those 3 days? Well, a lot of things happened, and we're about to find out that B was truly helpless. No one was there for her, not even her own mother. A very dark secret. In the years that have passed since this case unfolded, some pretty haunting details have emerged. B was very clearly suffering. Not only was she raised in a household with a violent father, but her mother was also all but absent from her life. We don't know if this was by choice or simply because she was trying to raise 10 children, but either way, it's inexcusable. B was suffering from the unimaginable, and, infuriatingly, the main perpetrator was someone she called Dad. It turns out, behind Sarah's back, B was being taken advantage of by Scott, in a nightmare that spanned nearly 7 years. But sadly, that wasn't all. B thought that she could turn to her other parent, her own mother, for security and comfort. But B was proven wrong yet again. When she came clean with her mother about what Scott had been doing to her, her mother didn't believe her. She called her own daughter a liar. Mind you, this is coming from a man who was openly abusive to his family, openly having affairs with other women, and he was even openly abusive to his previous family. But you don't believe he has it in him to take advantage of a young girl? Now I try my best to maintain composure when presenting these cases. But what a freaking moron. What a disgrace, and a wholehearted waste of breath. When you become a parent, your whole world changes. Your whole job on this planet is to take care of your children, always love them, always believe them, always protect them. But this disgusting excuse of a mother chose to just do nothing. If all of this wasn't bad enough, B's mother ended their conversation by telling B that she would literally kill her if she ever told anyone else about this. It is so nauseating that Sarah would rather stand up for a narcissistic and abusive man whom she had plans of leaving anyway, instead of her own daughter. What a wasted parenthood. But things didn't end there. As soon as Sarah made the call to report her daughter missing, 3 days after B apparently ran away, the operator asked some basic questions, whose answers were already very suspicious. Apparently, Sarah had received a text from B saying that she was staying with her ex-boyfriend Luke after she had run away. But the operator was baffled that Sarah or Scott hadn't gotten in contact with or visited Luke in order to see B. The operator immediately knew something was fishy. Regardless, the detectives began searching for B in neighboring areas. Police conducted searches in Gunthorpe, Newborough, and other parts of Peterborough and Cambridgeshire, but sadly, there was no sign of B. Another thing that investigators did that eventually pulled the curtain off the ruse Scott and Sarah were pulling was checking their phones, and boy, did they find a lot of strange things. Firstly, Scott's phone activity was very weird and all over the place on July 18th. See, his phone was turned off after he picked B up from his parents' house. This was from 11:23 a.m. to 12:54 p.m. And cell phone activity also showed him, as well as Sarah, going to a specific place multiple times after B was reported missing. It was a lock-up garage owned by his parents in Walton. Alarmingly, Scott also made a stop there the day he was supposed to take B back home from his parents' house. The detectives immediately went out to search this lock-up garage, and even though they didn't find B, they did find something of hers, a backpack. This backpack was immediately taken in as evidence, and what officers found inside gave them an idea about how much trouble B was in. See, B always kept a diary and wrote in it ever since she was young. but there was one journal entry that shocked the police. And it said, "Told my mom about my dad and the abuse. She called me a liar and threatened to kill me if I told the police." What kind of parent wouldn't believe their daughter? It is so heartbreaking to see B's sadness emanating from these words in her diary. She truly believed that Sarah would be on her side, but she was proven detrimentally wrong. But the detectives weren't done looking. They also decided to reach out to B's friends to ask about Scott's abuse, and most of them came forward with more details. According to one of B's friends, Warren Naylor, B had confided in him about Scott taking advantage of her. But Warren later pointed out that on July 19th, a day after B had apparently run away, he received a message from her on Instagram, which stated that she had lied about the abuse. But remember, Scott had confiscated B's phone en route to his parents' house. B didn't have access to her phone, so how could she text her friends, or even her mom, Sarah, about staying over at Luke's? Well, this was where the case took another unbelievable turn. Investigators, after some digging, found out that the messages being sent to Sarah and B's friends were from B's phone, but she obviously wasn't the sender. It was actually Sarah, her own mother. It was speculated that Scott, after learning that B had told her mother everything about his disgusting actions, lost his temper and attacked B and ended her life on the way back to her home from his parents' house. Scott didn't want his dirty laundry to be aired out and get him kicked out of the home, so he decided to take B out of the picture. But that wasn't all. Remember that Scott's phone was turned off for some time? Well, it is alleged that Scott took B's life during this time, a period of about 91 minutes, and disposed of her body somewhere miles away from home. Afterwards, the first call he made was to none other than Sarah, even though no one knows what was said on the call. It was 9 minutes long, and the police speculated that this was them discussing their plan on how to cover up B's murder. It is so heartless and unimaginable. But the thing is, Scott's actions were heinous no matter how you look at it. But what about Sarah? Didn't she feel an ounce of guilt discussing a cover-up for her own daughter's murder over the phone, with the very person who so viciously took her life? It is so chilling to think that Sarah went along with the whole plan of sending messages from B's phone to make it look like she was in contact with her friends and family. But in reality, it was actually Scott and Sarah's own doing. This proves just how little B's own mother actually cared about her, which is nearly impossible to understand. With all of this evidence, along with statements from B's friends and brother, Anthony, about Scott's abuse and him recording, everyone in the house, both Scott and Sarah Walker, were arrested on September 14, 2020, on charges of murder and perverting the course of justice. The detectives were still looking for B's body, but sadly they were unsuccessful, and to this day, B has never been found. The trial and sentencing. Something definitely happened to B, but if there wasn't a body, then how could a murder trial be successful? Well, the evidence against Scott and Sarah was just too damning, and coupled with the terrible abuse that B was enduring, there was a very clear motive for Scott. The trial mainly consisted of statements from B's friends about Scott taking advantage of her, even though Scott had the audacity to deny everything. When asked about the hidden cameras in the house and in the bathroom, Scott shockingly stood by his baseless stance of catching B in the act of hiding candy in the bathroom. But knowing what we know now, I think it's pretty clear to see why Scott put cameras in the bathroom. Another thing that the police came across was a Facebook post when B changed her relationship status from single to in a relationship with Luke. Now, there was nothing wrong with the post itself, but there was a very weird comment left under it. This makes me want to throw up even repeating the words, but Scott left a comment under the relationship status saying, "Any boy who kisses you better have the image of me in your head." He even included a black and white picture of himself to the comment. Even after this revelation, Scott continued to deny everything and still maintained that B simply ran away from the car on their way to home. Sarah, on the other hand, was a bit more cooperative during the investigation And she did admit to sending out texts from B's phone, pretending to be her, but obviously that plan failed pretty quickly because the texts did not sound like B at all. They lacked her personality, and the U-turn B made about lying about Scott taking advantage of her was so bizarre. Anyone who read it knew that the texts weren't from B. Top this with the 3-day wait before officially reporting. B missing, and so many holes in their stories just didn't add up. Even without being able to prove that Scott took B's life, and without ever finding B's body, the jury finally reached a verdict. In 2021, almost a year after B went missing, the Cambridge Crown Court found Scott Walker guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Another factor that was included in Scott's sentence was his uncooperativeness in disclosing information about B's body. Due to this, the prisoner's disclosure of information about Victims Act of 2020, better known as Helen's Law, that was passed in November 2020, was applicable in Scott's case. Helen's Law basically forbids criminals from getting released on bail if they don't disclose information about where they disposed of the victim's body. With Scott's trial and sentencing over, all that was left was Sarah. She was also tried in court. But there wasn't enough evidence to charge her with B's murder. It was unclear if she had known about Scott's terrible plan before it was carried out. But she was found guilty on the count of perverting the course of justice, similar to Scott, and she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The aftermath. Sadly, after 3 years since the verdict on 17-year-old Bernadette Walker's case, her body still hasn't been found, and no one besides Scott knows what happened to her. The police searched and combed through different areas and even employed the use of drones, searching equipment, and K-9 units. But tragically, nothing came up. The detective on B's case, Detective Justine Jenkins, said, "We may never know the truth about what Scott did and why, but we do know Bernadette had made allegations of abuse against him. B's brother, Anthony, fought till the end to find answers about why his sister's life was taken so suddenly and barbarically. He is still hopeful that the detectives will be able to locate B so that he can get a proper goodbye." But on December 22, 2023, the air around HM Prison in Full Sutton felt strangely cleaner than usual. Turns out that's because there was one less scumbag breathing it, as Scott had passed away that day, at the age of 53. The only unfortunate thing about his passing is that this officially means there's zero chance of investigators learning where B's remains were hidden. Why Scott didn't disclose information on where B's body was is still unclear. It may be that he still wanted some sort of control over B's grieving siblings, and he wanted to get the last word in. I genuinely have a hard time wrapping my mind around just how terrible, how awful, and how gross this disgusting man was. I mean, you already lost. You got caught. You got charged. You got convicted. Just give it up and tell your family where B is. It's very clear that at this point, Scott was only withholding this information because he knew how much it would hurt B's siblings. B was a gifted photographer who tried her best to see the good in everyone, even in the person who practically ruined and ended her life. She still respected him as her father. This is one of those cases that just sucks. I just wish there was something that we could do. Sarah is due to be released from prison in 2027, and who knows how this will pan out for the other 9 people she gave birth to. I hope, with everything I have, that this awful woman was able to turn her life around while behind bars. But I've got to be honest this time. I don't think there is any coming back from the awful person she was and maybe still is. Redemption is always possible, let's be clear about that. But sometimes, guys, if you've been the victim of this type of abuse, or if you are currently trapped in that situation, do not reach out to family. Do not reach out to friends. Reach out to the police. You can find help. There are people who will believe you. It's always best if you can provide some tiny shred of evidence to the police as well. But even if you can't, reach out. It is never too soon. But B is such a terrible, terrible example that it can always be too late. Don't let this happen to you, and if you know of someone who's in a similar situation, don't you dare let this continue. Step up. At the end of it all, I just hope that B's siblings are okay, and I just hope they're able to move on from this, because at the end of the day, sometimes that's all we can do is try to MVOE on. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. If you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It is totally free and keeps you up to date with all of my future videos. But my name is Pari, and I will catch you guys in the next one.